Well, it is the first Friday of the month, and what we do on the first Friday of every month is we invite Chris Hall from McNally Robinson Booksellers into the studio to feature 5 books that he believes, and I guess the bookstore believes, that would be a good read for the month of April, or any time really. So he's back here in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. How's everything going at the Forks?
The Forks is up and running and very off to a great start. Lots of great feedback and excitement and lots of attention online and otherwise. And yeah, we're very pleased.
Awesome. That's good to hear. So that you're keeping busy with that. And you're having time to read. You still have time to read.
Absolutely. Got to squeeze out the time to read.
Yeah. So tell us what to read for the month of April.
Well, let's start with a novel called Exit West. It's written by a fellow called or named Mohsin Hamid. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Reluctant Fundamentalist, made into a movie maybe a year or two ago now. That book made got a lot of attention at the time. He's a very, very different kind of writer, I would describe him. He's very understated. He doesn't waste any words, and he tells big stories, but in a very understated way. So very effective that way. In this novel, it's set in an unnamed country, but likely Syria, by my guess. A couple of young people, Nadia and Saeed, meet and fall in love, but their story is isn't able to be a cliched love story. It's disrupted by all the civil war that develops there, and they at some point feel forced to leave. This is a second novel that I've spoken about here, and very recently, the other one being Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, where each of those authors use a device that is unrealistic, but allows them to talk more about the point of departure of their characters and the point of arrival of the partners or the characters. And so in Colson Whitehead's book, The Underground Railroad is literally an underground railroad. He doesn't waste any time on the journey. And in this book, Hamid uses a metaphor, I guess, of a door. And so Nadia and Saeed hear rumors about these doors that can step through and magically take you to somewhere else. And so they make arrangements and pay their money, and they find this door, and they suddenly find themselves in Europe. And so it just takes away that whole journey part and allows Hamid to concentrate on why they left and what their experiences is so in their destination.
Magical realism in a sense, right?
Yeah, but
rooted in fact.
But
what's happening in today.
Otherwise, both novels are very realistic. They've just got this plot device that allows for this interesting, something a novel can do that nonfiction can't. But makes for allows them to tell the story in a different way than they otherwise could.
So it's just a matter of time until this one becomes a movie. Sounds like it's perfect for a film.
I would not be surprised.
So we've got next one we have is I've seen this author before, Lisa Genova.
Genova, I believe.
Lisa Genova.
Yeah.
What was her last book? She did Still Alice.
Still Alice was
Still Alice.
the first
I remember
book.
seeing the movie. Still Alice was a great film.
I think Still Alice was, if not her first book, certainly the one that established her name. It's a number of years ago now. Still Alice was a book about an aging couple where one of the partners comes down with Alzheimer's, and so it's the story of one partner disappearing and the other one, experiencing that. Genova is a neuroscientist by training, and so I think she's able to capture both sides of issues. So Alzheimer's, she would know the medical side and very intimately and be able to tell kind of the rational brain part of this story. But then on the other hand, as a novelist, get into the emotions and the toll that living through these experiences take.
Yeah, not an easy thing to do. I mean, usually you're a scientist, you don't necessarily have that sort of creative background. If you're creative, you don't necessarily have that scientific background. She has them both, which is pretty unique.
Most of us can access the fear and the grief and so on of these experiences, but it's hard to know what's happening, what's really happening. So she can provide that too.
So what's her newest book? Every Note Played.
Every Note Played is has music, and which would be relevant to your listeners. Main character is a concert pianist, and so obviously has fingers that are very well calibrated and able to dance across the keyboards. But he comes down with ALS, and so slowly loses feeling and loses the ability to use his body eventually. So he loses his left arm, and so at the point where early in the book he's most of the story comes from when he's already lost his left side, but he knows the right side is going, and so in the meantime, his marriage has failed, but his partner Corinna is struggling on her own as well, and so they kind of come together. She reluctantly becomes his caregiver, and so there's lots of levels of the story to be told there.
In conversation with Chris Hall from McNally Robinson Booksellers, and it is the April edition of What to Read. We're focusing on 5 books that you may want to check out at their bookstore for the month of April. The next one is our first nonfiction.
Yes, Heartberries it's called. It's by Therese Marie Maillot. Debut book by this author. She's a young woman who grew up in the Seabird Island Indian Reservation in British Columbia. This is a very raw, visceral book, using poetic language rather than realistic language. And she really takes you right into her mind of her struggles as she growing up as an Indigenous person. She's ends up hospitalized for bipolar and PTSD, and her story comes out in bits and pieces, fits and starts, if you will. And so you feel very much inside her mind, and the writing is almost out of control. The sentences aren't necessarily complete, and thoughts aren't complete, but it feels very realistic that this is, you know, our lives don't unfold in long, beautiful sentences.
Yeah,
not always, at least. And so her story certainly hasn't. And you feel her pain, you feel her helplessness, you feel her despair, and it's a very, very affecting work for sure.
From Heartberries, we Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Snyder.
Yes, Timothy Snyder is a historian by trade. He wrote a book called Bloodlands. That subtitle of that was Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Snyder specializes in the history of the land between and including Russia and Germany, so particularly, of course, in the 20th century. So Bloodlands told the story about the devastation of countries like Poland and Ukraine during the war and thereafter, and so that's kind of his specialty. He's taken to writing books that are more current affairs. He wrote a book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, where he takes the historical lessons from the rise of Hitler and Stalin and has a look at, kind of says, are any similarities with what's going on in the world these days?
Yes, don't go down that wormhole again.
I know, I'm going
trying
back.
to warn you in advance.
I'm going back. So this one's a road to unfreedom. This is literally a year-by-year, chapter-by-chapter accounting of what's happened in Russia since 2010. Slowly but surely, Putin has shut down institutions and become more and more kind of the dictator of that country, and how he's done that. Soviet Union in the 20th century was a master of misinformation. It's kind of how it's kept its citizenry off guard, and they're off balance, and there's a whole tradition of absurd literature that comes out of the Soviet Union, and so now they've taken some of those skills, and Snyder and others' theory is that they've taken it online and abroad. They don't have goals necessarily in countries like the U.S. and England. They just want to disrupt everything, and so all the misinformation they're sending out on Facebook and so on, it's just messing stuff up, and is really undermining our the sorts of values that we've relied on, and yeah, it's a scary book.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's turn the page quickly.
I heartily recommend it.
Yes. The Sparsholt Affair.
Yes, back to fiction.
Yeah, we can hide the fiction.
Exactly. This is a novel, the latest novel by Alan Hollinghurst. Alan Hollinghurst is one of the world's best stylists, I will say. He's a great writer. I would read anything he's writing just because he can tell such a great story in such a great way. He wrote Line of Beauty, where he won the Man Booker Prize. That was back in 2004. This novel is about a fellow named David Sparsholt, student at Oxford in the early days of World War II. He's very handsome, very alluring, physically attractive, and both men and women find him very, very attractive and kind of maneuver with one another to try to get into his sphere and into his life, And so his best friends and the friends around him at school refer to this situation, I guess, as the Sparsholt affair. And so then the book heads off 20 years later, and the affair continues. And it starts to tell the story of Sparshult's son, who in England in the 60s is negotiating civil rights and gay rights, the rise of gay rights and things, and his experience starts to have these eerie parallels with his father that, that maybe if his father grew up at a different time, he'd have been a different person. And it's very interesting, very well-told story. Hollinghurst would do no less.
Well, yeah, having won the Man Booker Prize, the guy can write, I'm assuming.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you know what? It doesn't matter what the story's about. He's just worth reading. Absolutely.
Well, that's the April edition of What to Read. We've covered 5 books. They're all posted on our website, and then we link you over to McNally's website to have a look at them and to get them as well. You can go in person. McNally Robinson, they have a store now at the Forks, or you can check them out in Grant Park Mall. They're a long-time establishment there. Thanks for coming in. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to give a little shout out to Michelle Holt, because Michelle's been asking us. She's a young listener. She's 10 years old, and she says, well, it's not only adults that listen to this show, it's kids listen to this show as well. Why don't you do any kids or teen books? So we've been urging Chris. It's not his expertise. That's right. Even though he's got kids. He does have kids. It's not his expertise. So we're going to work on it. In the next few months, we'll probably be bringing in somebody who's very familiar with books for kids and teens, and we'll be featuring at least one book for kids and teens.
Absolutely. I'll bring in a cohort.
You'll bring a cohort, yes. Somebody more familiar with the young kids' books.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's great. So we look forward to that. Thanks again for coming in.
Thank you.
Chris, we'll see you again in May.
Yes.
Hard to believe unless I see you in the store before that.
I hope the weather's nicer.
It will be.
Absolutely.
What do you mean you hope? It will be. We're going to reach spring at some point. I promise that. So you've been listening to What to Read with McNally Robinson Booksellers. The first Friday of every month, Chris Hull, co-owner from McNally Robinson, comes in and features 5 books.